All right, everybody, welcome to today's Top Leaders. I'm Jen Anderson, and as a coach, I'm working very closely with technology leaders to help you to do everything that you can to retain that talent so that you can make sure that you're hitting those important goals that you want to hit. I know that they're important, you know that they're important. And so, and in doing that and helping you to really reduce that attrition, it's going to make a difference for you in how you're feeling about yourself as a leader and how other people are perceiving you. And so on these weekly lives, I want to make sure that you know that this information here is to help you to really grow and to develop and to become that tech leader that everyone wants to work for. Because really, not only are you worth it, but also your people are worth it as well as you become a better leader. So, with that said, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have the wonderful Lark Galley with me here today. Hello, Lark.
Hello, thanks, Jen.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lark and why she's here with us today. So, this is some really interesting stuff to think about this idea about what, as a leader, you can be doing to help with those who might be dealing with grief, might even be yourself, and dealing with grief during the holidays. And so, Lark has spent 25 years in a corporate career before going out on her own as an entrepreneur. After experiencing the suicides of both her father and son, as well as the death of an employee, Lark realized the workplace could play a bigger role in supporting personal grief and identifying crisis behaviors. Such engagement would in turn allow companies to improve their ROI and develop greater employee loyalty. Lark is a published author, speaker, and trainer. Her goal is to help 100,000 people choose to stay on this planet and help step into their greatness. So I asked Lark to come on today specifically because just recently, it was just this last week or so, she had posted 4 things to think about when you're dealing with grief during the holidays. And that got me really thinking about how we need to talk about this right now because the holidays are here, even though we're not technically really at that Christmas week, but it's here. We're right in the middle of it. And then the interesting thing too is that the holiday doesn't just stop with like Christmas, right? So it continues. And I think there's kind of the winter doldrums that hit us as well. In my mind, I kind of look at a lot of that kind of combined too, but I'd like to talk with you more about that for sure, Lark. And so I want to start us off with basically a definition of what grief is, and then let's definitely talk more. We'll get into it. So here's how grief is defined, and this is on Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge, right? Just kidding, but it's a good source. So on Wikipedia, it says grief is a response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or some living thing that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, grief also has physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. So I really appreciated how on Wikipedia they identified 7 things around grief and how it's impacting us. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd so agree because sometimes people think, oh, first of all, that grief only comes with a death, which is not always true. You and I talked about that. We
Yeah.
both moved this past year, and that can bring on grief, even if it's something good, maybe getting a promotion or switching companies. While it might be perceived as good, and maybe it is good, we're grieving something we left behind. Maybe it's friends or colleagues, an opportunity that we sort of passed on or didn't get to fulfill. But then this grief, this idea of grief of when a loss over a loved one, that's really hard because that's not always for the better, and it impacts us in so many ways, as I've been coming to understand these last few years.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting because I do remember, Lark, when we were talking about how we both had moved this last year, that it hit me in a different way all of a sudden. I was so grateful to have that conversation with you because it reminded me, oh yeah, like and my move just happened. I mean, literally not even 2 weeks ago. Like this is very, very new. But it was this realization through our conversation of, oh, I wonder I'm feeling some feels. Yes, it's exciting to move to a new place. Yes, it's exciting, anticipation of, whatever else. But there's this whole slew of like underlying emotions of pain and feeling this worry about disconnect and some other stuff that happens. And I was so grateful to have a little bit of a light shown on that in that moment of, okay, I'm not losing my marbles. I'm grieving something here. You know what I mean? Like, okay, this is, although I know sometimes I do feel like I'm losing my marbles, but but the deal is where I'm going with this is like, oh, that's why I'm feeling this stuff, as opposed to feeling like I had to lean in and push harder and work harder and just, buck up, kind of stuff. And it was like, oh, okay. No wonder.
And you know what? Having those emotions shows that you're human, right?
Yeah.
And we are human and we have emotions, and it actually separates us from our humanness and our connection with other people when we don't allow ourselves to feel the feels and to acknowledge that other people go through the feels.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're not a bunch of robots. I mean, come on.
Which makes life fun, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think about because I work with a lot of tech teams, right? And so these are people who are very smart mathematically, science, things like that. And they're, I've had many of them over the years say to me, the hardest part is people. Interacting with the people. They do great with the computer. They can make the computer do all the things that they want it to do, but the people. And so then it's learning for themselves, learning and also how am I going to respond to this, right? Not only are they going through stuff, but what am I going to do to support them, etc. There's a lot to unpack around that.
There is.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So what else would you say is grief? What else would you want to talk about on that?
Just grief is the separation in some way, and it's not experiencing the connection that you might have experienced in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've tried to be very intentional and I mentioned as I moved, and I thought after you and I talked last week, it's like, okay, you and I are no longer in the same state, but that doesn't mean that we can't connect. And you reached out and you called me, and then we're doing this, and we can see each other virtually.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I will just say that connecting with your colleagues, with your friends, staying connected is so important. I think with the COVID lockdowns, that's been something that people have experienced, and I saw it in my father, who was bipolar before he died by suicide 8 years ago, is that he really struggled with connection. And what he thought was the answer, because he was hurting, was to separate himself from his family. What the answer really was to come together and to connect. So if you are feeling like you might be alone for the holidays, change that. Do something where you're reaching out, you're connecting with someone else, even if it's going to serve in a homeless shelter where you're showing up on Christmas to serve. Find some human connection. It will make a difference in your life.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Whew. I just want to sit with that for a second, about that whole human connection. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal, and people pulling away and into themselves. And an additional unfortunate thing that you and I have in common is that my dad had also committed suicide. Now, that suicide was about 33 years ago. And and I was a freshman in high school, right? So I was completely ill-equipped, had no idea. And I don't even know that I even knew of suicide before that. Like maybe I'd heard about it somewhere, but I didn't really understand, where unfortunately I do see more kids know about it now today. I mean, it's very much, hate to say it's the norm, but it's not unheard of, if you will. Right?
They are exposed to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I think about like when my dad committed suicide, he definitely pulled into himself, for sure. He was experiencing problems at work, and um, and that led to some real deep downward cycle kind of stuff. And it's so funny when we think about how people say like, oh, work is important, but don't make your whole life about work. But like when work goes south, things are difficult.
Right. And I would say, especially for men with work, because that's where their self esteem, their image, who they identify as,
Yeah.
it is so much tied up with their work and their ability to provide for their family, which is why we see a lot of middle aged men um, dying by suicide. They feel like they're a burden to their family. They can't fulfill that role that they feel they need to fill, and
Mhm.
we're seeing huge numbers of men in that role. And now women are also stepping into that role, because not only has as traditional, oh, our image is our identity, now also our career is our identity. So
Mhm.
we're being we're also being put into that place as well. But for men, it's even more poignant with their ability to provide. And we need to be supportive of each other, and especially be supportive of our men, the men in our
Mhm.
lives.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And isn't it? Um, it's amazing what data and statistics can do, right? So when we start knowing and understanding that there's a large segment of middle-aged men who are dealing with this depression and these challenges, then it becomes, oh, okay, well, who are those guys? Who are, and it's not just like it might not just be like for us, like our husbands or whatnot, but they're like other people that are around us.
They could be our sons, our brothers.
Mhm. Yeah, right. Our coworkers, our neighbors, right? Yeah,
And
yeah.
I will tell you this, as I've started doing suicide prevention work, people have felt safe coming to me and talking to me about their personal situations. And a lot of the people that do this, you would never suspect that they are struggling with suicide ideation, or with feeling fulfilled in their life, or
Mm,
they feel like they're a burden to their family.
mm,
And so you never know who it's happening to. And also, I've been involved in the entrepreneur community out here in Utah, where, Silicon Slopes, as you know, and there have been a lot of suicides in the entrepreneur community, with specifically men who have created companies that have really done well, and then they felt, well, I can't top that, or I can't live under this
mm.
pressure. And there have been a lot of men who have either died by suicide from that, or also have suicide ideation, and they do specific things to help make sure they stay aware of what they're feeling, and to stay connected to people.
Yeah, that's good. I'm curious, what are some ideas that you've heard that works well for them to get past that ideating?
Uh-huh. So number one is, to stay connected with their loved ones, their family, and to
Mm,
make sure they take time, both family time and also me time, doing
mm,
things that they enjoy, and connecting. For me, a big part of it is being in nature, and making sure I'm exercising my body and eating good foods and getting enough sleep, because we so often think, oh, I just need to work harder. I need to do this. I need to do that. And I promise you that that is not always the answer. Maybe getting 7 hours of sleep a night, that might be the answer, and it might help you feel so much better, mentally and physically, that then you can go out and conquer the other challenges. And also, without the connections outside work, and I can totally understand this. I would say that I'm a workaholic, and I have had to take intentional steps to, okay, in the evening it's dinner time with the family, and it's then I get to read something that is not associated in any way with work. It's something that I might enjoy, and I have to do specific things, or I would just turn into this 24/7 work person.
mhm.
And nobody wants to be around someone like that.
Yeah. Right. I love that you talked about the me time. Oh my gosh. Because I think also there's a lot of us that we are married or living, significant other situation, and we have children. And so often, especially as a parent, putting our needs secondary, tertiary, whatever, pretty far down the list. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I'm glad to hear that you're hearing about that in that entrepreneurial community as well, that they're recognizing, okay, what do I need to do so that I get some me time as well?
Exactly.
It's,
You know,
yeah.
and I can understand there are different seasons. And when I had young kids, my me time was getting up at 5 in the morning and going out for a quick 30-minute run and coming back and getting ready for the day before those kids woke up, right?
Mhm.
And that was me time. But I intentionally carved it out, and because it meant something for me. Maybe me time is getting a bubble bath. Uh, I can remember when having a bubble bath was like that was the biggest extravagance because I didn't really have a lot of discretionary time.
Right.
So there are things, and it doesn't mean that you have to spend money. It can just be doing something, reading a book that you
Mhm.
love. I
Mhm.
love reading a good historical fiction novel. I love it. It's
Yeah.
like eating ice cream. And so if you carve yourself, 15, 20 minutes to do something that you love, bless you,
Thank you.
that that's so important, and it can give you the joy. It's kind of like when you're cooking a meal, to add a little bit of spice. think of
Yeah.
think of eating a meal without any spice. It's bland, and I
Yeah.
promise your life will be bland and feel bland if you don't give a little spice.
Right. Yes. I love that. That's it for sure. We don't, and there's lots of options for spice. So when we think about life in comparison to the spice cabinet, right? There are lots of options, and I love how you just gave a couple of good examples of even getting up a little bit early in the morning. And that I've heard from so many people over the years where they're like, "Are you kidding me? I'm freaking tired. I'm not getting up at 5 a.m. or even 6 a.m. I'll sleep as long as I can until the kids get up." And I'm like, "Yeah, but how are you doing?" Because they don't create any of that alone time,
Hmm.
And I'm like, let's just remember as an individual person, like you are your own individual person first, and then you add your family that you have later. I'm talking about like as an adult, for example, you add your family members to over time, and it's like, but you were that person, that individual person, and then maybe you dated and then you got married, or whatever. And so, but it's like, don't forget, what do you need? And then, golly, how often are we not speaking up and not asking for what we need,
Right.
right?
Well,
And
especially women. Women fall into that category where,
right,
oh, I'm not important. My needs are not important. But no, they are. And there can be some men that feel that way as well. But
yeah,
have a list of things, like when somebody asks, "What do you want for Christmas or for your birthday?" And speak up and tell people what you would love. And it doesn't have to be a big gift. It can be, "I would love to go out to this specific restaurant or to go and have a walk in this area." Something that
yeah.
you would enjoy.
Yeah, I like that. That's so good. Have a list. What a good, simple thing. And all of us have these lovely smartphones that have a note taking app in there, right? And so we could absolutely just create my wish list, or, what I want list or
Yes.
something, yeah, I think that's a fun, easy way to make note of that and then be ready to answer the questions. It's so good when it comes to grief and supporting. I want to talk with you a little bit about how can we support the people that are on our teams as well. So we've talked a little bit about leaders and things they can do for themselves too, but let's talk about suggestions you would have about. So let's say you've got a tech leader or leader somewhere who has an employee that maybe something happened. Let's talk about like maybe a death in their family or something like that. So what suggestions would you have to help them, Lark?
And so, just to preface this, that death can have happened earlier in the year. It could have happened a couple years ago. It doesn't have to have happened just last week,
Great
because
point.
especially the holidays trigger these feelings. They're remembering, oh, so and so isn't going to be here this holiday, especially the first Christmas that a loved one isn't there.
Mhm.
Those are the firsts are always difficult. And something to remember that I've had to recognize is that it doesn't just show up on the holiday itself. It usually starts about 2 or 3 weeks before the holiday.
Yeah.
And I have noticed in myself irritability, uh, exhaustion. I'm just like short
Mm.
tempered. I'm more emotional. And because it wasn't right at the holiday, I was like, what is this? And I finally connected it. It's because, you subconsciously know the holiday is coming up and aren't going to be happening. The certain
Mm,
traditions or the person isn't going to be here. So just know if someone on your team uh, seems a bit short tempered, irritable, even a few weeks before the holiday, it's that their body is reacting to what they know is coming, and they're
mm.
trying to protect themselves for this emotional pain that they are anticipating.
Ooh, it's so good to know that that's something that's showing up for people weeks in advance of the actual holiday. I think it's really good because I wasn't aware of the fact that that actually starts to build even then with that
Yeah,
anticipation. So that makes a lot of sense though. Because there's even the things like, for example, we went to go drive through a park last night that had like a big, huge park, hundreds and hundreds of acres. They had all these beautiful lights set up, so there's all these cars bumper to bumper for like an hour going through this thing. And and it's a couple of weeks before Christmas, right? But then there's that loss of, oh, so and so used to do this drive with us, right? We go scoop up grandma and we put her in the front seat and take her to go see the lights. Now grandma's not with us anymore. So
exactly,
there's that.
exactly.
Yeah, that's another. So what happens though, like, because sometimes I think about how, like, sometimes our employees don't tell us that somebody died,
Right.
right? Or it could have been even years ago before they started working for your team now. So what might be some signals that you could pick up on something's wrong?
You know what? I would say brain fog. I noticed this for me specifically when my father died. I went through 5 months of brain fog where I would go to a meeting, I would take notes, and 2 days later I would look at the notes and I would say, "That's my handwriting, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with these notes, and I don't even remember being in the meeting." And when I was talking with a
Mm,
therapist about this, he said it was your way of coping, of trying to just deal with this reality that was so overwhelming for you. You didn't want to recognize it. And so if your employees seem a bit distracted or they're not on top of their game like they might have been in the past, pull them aside and just say, "Hey, I noticed some things. What's on your mind?" And do it in a very kind and a desire to understand them, not to berate them. Um, I know someone who went into her employer when her brother died by suicide, and she tried to explain that she was struggling and she maybe needed some time off. And he responded by yelling at her and demoting her. So you can see, why some people might be hesitant to really share
mhm.
their struggles.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's sad. That's hard.
Exactly. And here's the other thing I'll say is that um, I will never be the same person I was before my father's suicide and before my son's suicide. And in some ways, I grieve that. I grieve being that A type personality, get her done, put your big girl pants on and just run out and do it. I I will never be that person again.
Yeah.
My DNA has changed. That grief has affected me in ways I never thought possible. And so
Mhm.
now I just have to say, okay, I have gained other traits and insights that I would not have had before this happened.
Yeah.
I'm more compassionate. I understand grief at a level that I never understood before. I can empathize
Mhm.
with people who have gone through it. I can sit and analyze and see people in new ways, in these people skills and connection that I wasn't even interested in having before. So I
Yeah.
have to say I'm not that person that I was before. I will never be that person. But what can I do with the strengths that I have learned and the things that I've gone through now? How can I show up?
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, that's I'm just kind of thinking a little bit how you talked about your DNA has changed. I mean, like, we're basically getting down to the basic cellular level of who we are, right? And I
Exactly.
think sometimes people are like, nope, I'm just gonna push through it. I can work hard, or I can go do whatever the thing is to get over the grief, right? So it's the eating, the drinking, the over shopping, the addictions, the other stuff, or the relation way how we're not handling things very well, because it's like what I just love how you just pointed out, that basically when this stuff hits in your life, it's changing you at a very, very deep to your core way. So you know the
Right.
and I think that, let's talk a little bit about like society, right? And how, like, we want people to be those A-type personalities. We want people to be the go-getter, I'm gonna take on the world kind of stuff. It's like it's hard being around somebody who's sad.
Mhm. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a sad or a grief. It's just maybe an emptiness sometimes. And
Yeah.
there can be some sadness. And I will say that, it's not like I want to be sad, or it's not like I want to
Right.
grieve, right? But there is a piece that's missing that I can't change.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say, how can we support other people? Is support them in ways that they are seeking support. So I had some very close friends several months after our son died, and they were continually trying to get my husband and me to come out to activities. This was before COVID. Come out to activities, come to this play, it'll be so fun, or come to this movie with us. And they wanted to give us this fun. And after, three very intense invitations, like intense invitations, I finally said, we aren't in the space where we want to do this, where we can even show up. What was funny to us before, it's just not funny anymore. And it's like it's hard to laugh. It's hard to do that. We try to come to things that we can, and maybe stay for a little bit, and leave earlier than maybe we might have done in the past. But we try to show up in ways that we can show up. And so we just ask that the people around us be supportive of however we do show up.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And paying attention, and hopefully intuitive enough to notice, okay, this is what's going on. I do know for myself, when I've been in like workplace environments and dealing with somebody who's going through a challenging thing that's bringing up grief and emotions and whatnot. Like I'm thinking about a gentleman who worked for me, um, and his mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and he was in his, at the time, he was right around 30 years old, give or take a year. And so this was like the first time something really big was happening to his parents in his lifetime. I mean, other than getting the flu, or, like his dad fell and broke his arm once or something like that. But this was like the holy cow, my mom might die because she has breast cancer. Right. And so what I was really grateful for is that before cancer showed up, he and I had the tradition of getting together every week to have one-on-one time to talk specifically about what was going on for him in his life and his career, just conversational, like how you doing? What's going on? What are things that are happening? And he was married and his wife was working, so like I just wanted to, stay connected with him, because I felt like I was having lots of touch points with him in the office, but having that one-on-one time. And I was really grateful to have that in place before the thing happened. Because then
Yes.
when we had that time to sit down, and he told me, he said, I'm really grateful that we already have this meeting in place. He's like, because if we didn't, I probably would not have asked for that private one-on-one time with you.
No, exactly. And it's kind of like, think of your teenagers, your children, right? If you don't set a base for them when they're in their early years, they're not going to show up as teenagers and be like, "Hey, let me tell you everything that's going on," right?
Yeah.
And the employees are the same, and our coworkers, and how we show up and respond to them. They might give us a little insight into some things, that difficulties that they're going through,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we respond to that, and then they'll go on and maybe share some bigger things. So I do have employees, and I'm always touched when they're honest with me, and they tell me maybe some struggles that they're going through, and I can have more compassion with maybe they show up a little bit late. It's not a normal thing, but once in a while that might happen. Okay, what's going on with them?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
I have drivers, and sometimes they get into small accidents. And it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, what's going on in your mind? Why are you distracted? What's happening here? And
Mhm.
how do I show up for them um, when that happens? And I had one
Mhm.
employee who said, "Thank you so much for not yelling at me. You were so kind when I had this small accident." He said, "I've been going through a lot, and he's been going through a really hard divorce. He's trying to
Mhm.
manage his kids and all of that, and
Mhm.
and so because I showed up for him, he's going to say, I really appreciate the way she showed up for me. I'm going to continue to show up and be a good employee for her."
Mhm. I love that. It's so important to have that kindness in that moment, right? And so as opposed to the other example that you shared with that guy who yelled at the lady and demoted her and whatnot, and like, holy moly. And in my mind, I go to like, what's going on in his life? That's how he responded.
You're right, because he was going through a divorce. He was struggling in his relationships with his children. They didn't want anything to do with him.
Right.
So you're right. It's ripples. Everything ripples out, and
Mhm.
how you and that's why it's so important as you as a leader. You need to take care of yourself so that you're in a good spot, so that you can have compassion for your employees. A difficult thing is finding and hiring good people, and we have to realize that our employees are our biggest resource. We need them, right?
Yes.
And also ourself is our most important resource. For ourselves, we have to take care of ourselves, because it could be us that, as I mentioned, that was going through the difficult time when
Mhm.
my father died, and I was having to do things that I did not want to do, and was completely unexpected. And so as we learn these skills for ourselves, then we can help support our employees, our coworkers, when they are going through difficult times, especially during the holidays. It just heightens everything. And something to explain to people who maybe haven't experienced grief. It's like the Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy's in Oz, and it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's so beautiful. And then when she goes back to Kansas, it's black and white. It goes back to black and white again. My life, in many aspects, is like the black and white,
Mm.
and I try to add a bit of spice and a bit of color, but underneath it is fairly black and white, in the sense that a lot of the joy that I had before is gone, and it's not coming back. Not in the
Yeah.
way that it was before, right?
Yeah.
So I need to find new joy and new ways.
Mhm.
And so for someone who has not been through a deep grief or deep sadness, that's what these people are feeling like, who are going through grief. Their life is black and white,
Yeah.
and it's not your role to help, like, cheer them up, but just to be there wherever they are in their emotions.
I can totally visualize, right? The Wizard of Oz and in the black and white. That was great visualization for sure. Because um, I think if you're not there, you don't know what they're going through. At least you can start to appreciate a little bit. Ah, okay, the color has gone out. Okay, doesn't mean the whole thing is completely blank, but the color has gone out, the vivaciousness of that,
Yes,
right? So
yes.
and meeting them where they're at, right? And so, and I think about like the ebb and flow, right? As leaders, like we have times when we're feeling top of the world, things are great, and then stuff comes crashing down, right? And top of the world, or not even top, like doing really good and comes down, like all these ups and downs. And so, how, like, any suggestions you have for ourselves to embrace that ride, that up and down?
So two things. Number one, I would say, be honest with your coworkers, with your employer, or and your employees. If you're having a difficult time, say, hey, I'm having a hard time right now, or be honest. Don't try to put on a facade. People see through it anyway. I promise. I did something with recently. I wrote, in the last couple months, I've written two checks that were going to my business partner, and I left off the line where you write out the amount. So he went to the bank and he tried to cash it. He couldn't cash it. And he was so compassionate to me. He said, I realize you must have a lot on your mind. And I just was so grateful for that compassion. I'm like, as a matter of fact, I do have a lot on my mind. And so these things where we are not perfect. We're human.
Mhm.
And to allow these things to happen in our lives where we don't show up 100%, and to recognize it in other people, like they must be going through something, and it's okay.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so good. Any suggestions that you have about what a team can do to support somebody that's maybe going through something?
Be It's so interesting, and I would say take your cues from the person, right?
Okay.
um, I enjoy having people who knew my son and my father talk to me about them, share memories. I love that. So maybe if a team knew about someone that there's been a loss, I share a great memory. I Here's another thing. Uh, when my daughter was working, and I mentioned that my son, her brother, died by suicide. She had two different coworkers in her company just come up privately and say, I understand your brother died by suicide. I lost XYZ by suicide, last year or a couple years ago, and I want you to know I'm here to talk with you. I'm available if you need need to talk. And she didn't take them up on the offer, but she said the fact that they even came and said that just to her privately, she was so touched and felt supported. Those two instances were the most support that she felt at the time in her company. And so, you know, and you don't need to go into a drawn out story and explain why your grief is greater than their grief, or why their loss of a dog is really not important because that dog might have been the most important thing to them in the world, right? It might have been all that they had.
Yes,
And
right.
so, it's not the same, but they're grieving. They've had a loss. And so, not to make
Mhm.
light of whatever loss they feel, and to to maybe just talk to them, be there. Don't ignore them. If they're going through a loss, or they're experiencing something, don't pretend that it's not happening, because it's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That's good. That's really, really good. I love that because that whole comparison thing. I'm thinking of the comedian, I can't remember, Brian Regan, how he has a comparison monster video. Oh my gosh, if you haven't seen that yet, look that up on YouTube, because it's like, the person, oh, they're always the one who one ups everybody. And so it's like, when it comes to grief and loss, like, don't be one upping. Like, that's where your limits are at, you know?
Well, and here's another thing. I sometimes have people say, "I know what you're going through," and I will tell
Okay.
you this: no, you don't know what I'm going through.
Right.
Even if your son died by suicide, your relationship with your son was probably completely different from my relationship.
Mhm.
What I'm going through is different from what my husband is going through. Is different from what my children are going through.
Yeah.
And so, instead of saying, "I know what you're going through," just say, I've walked this road, and I know that it's a heavy road." Something
Mhm.
like that. But just, I'm so careful not to say, I know what you're going through, because I promise I don't.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Just like you wouldn't have known those juicy, beautiful moments either because you weren't there. Right. So yeah, that's good. I love that. That's a really, really good point. Any other suggestions that you would have for us on, as leaders, what can we do to support our people with
So,
their
so something I just think of, like, for myself, um, I I do not do a lot of the things I used to do around the holidays. For me, doing Christmas cards, I've done it for 30 years. It was the big thing. I would orchestrate a big photography session. The whole family had to be there. We sometimes, it was coordinated outfits. One year it was even elf outfits. I mean, it was over the top, and it was planned months in advance. I don't do the photo shoot anymore. I don't do the Christmas card anymore. Those things aren't important to me. I
Mhm.
struggle. I don't want to put up a Christmas tree. That's not where I'm at. I put up, as you can see in the background there, I have a couple of Christmas decorations, but I just don't put into it what I did before. A lot of that joy is out. And so, if as a leader, if sometimes you're feeling that way, still try to give joy and help support your employees through their happy, joyous time, the holiday time.
Yeah.
But give yourself a pass in that. you don't always have to show up like you did in the past. And if, um, your holidays are a bit scaled back, that's okay. And just allow the grace of your employees if they're not feeling, the over the
Mhm,
top Christmas
mhm,
spirit.
mhm,
Let that be okay. Let them be okay wherever they are able to show up.
mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And also thinking about as leaders, we don't have to do the thing. Can we find somebody else on the team who's like all gung ho about they're excited. They want to plan the Christmas party. Great. Let them do it, right?
Yes,
Instead
yes,
of trying to muster up
yes.
some kind of fake excitement when you're not feeling it, right? Or,
Right.
or where, wherever it's coming from too. So
And something else on that is, my motivation and what motivates me now from before my son's death is completely different.
mm,
I do a lot with suicide prevention. I want people to know about suicide, and so for me, that's what motivates me. If someone, you have a coworker or employee that maybe a family member died by cancer or suicide, and they want to organize, a team walk where they do the suicide prevention walk or something like that, they might be so motivated about do that. let let them do that, something where your team can support and go
yeah.
out in the community and be visual and visible in helping support and strengthen the community. And the person who's maybe going through a grief, who has been touched most by a certain situation, they might be the perfect person to lead that. Now, they
Mm,
might not be the perfect person to lead that, but they might be, and they might be very motivated
mhm,
and be grateful to have that opportunity to fulfill that leadership role
mhm,
in
mhm.
some kind of
Yeah.
service.
Sure, I can see that. Absolutely. Absolutely. When I was that 14-year-old who did not want to be the kid whose dad committed suicide, I mean, this was back in 1989. I was all about Guess jeans, Esprit, and Swatch, right? Like that's what I wanted my life to be. I didn't want my life to be that girl whose dad committed suicide, you know? And so then I fast forward from that 6 years later, I'm in college, and one of my friends in the dorms, her dad had committed suicide. And again, nobody else around us had a lot of exposure. And so I was grateful to be in that situation because I had like other dorm mates and whatnot. They said, "How do we help her?" And I said, "Well, you'll, be her friend, go and talk to her, ask her how she's doing." I said, but I kind of gave them some insight around this might be some stuff she's dealing with. But like you just said, but that was my story. She has her own situation that she's going through. And so, like for example, my parents were divorced, her parents were not divorced, right? So I already had some other family turmoil that was going on. So she had a different type of turmoil that was happening for her. And so it was remarkable to be in that situation, to show kindness and compassion from something that was tough for me,
Right. And
and help.
and that might be a role that, someone is playing now. I am the person that people reach out to when they've had a family member or a friend who's died by suicide. I get the call, I get the message, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I help share with them some resources that can guide them, that were supportive in my situation.
Yeah.
And so I it's not great to get those calls, but I'm glad that people recognize that I can
Mm-hmm.
support and help them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's lovely about it is that because you're there, because you're talking about it, because you're being vulnerable and open about it, you're, I mean, you're allowing people to say, "Hey, I'm willing to be a resource," right? Because you don't know if and when they're ever going to need it. You have no
Right,
idea, right?
right.
But I think about how that happens in teams. That and there have been times where I've been a part of teams or I've done consulting with teams, and something happens, and it's like all of a sudden somebody's like, "Oh, yes, that happened to me too. When my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, these are some things that we did." And all of a sudden
Yes,
it connected them in a completely different way for those coworkers,
yes.
but
Because they
before
were
that, you
human,
might talk
and they
about
showed, yeah, and they showed their human side, and they
it.
showed the emotions that they were going through. And
Yeah,
so
right.
instead of isolating and saying, I show up at work and I'm got this facade on and I'm perfect and I do everything perfectly, be
Uh-huh.
real, especially as a leader, be real.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Please, let's do it for ourselves, and all, yeah, for us and for them, right? So we're all needing it for sure. Lark, as we're putting a bow around this, I had to say that because this is Christmas time, but as we're putting a bow around this, what would you want people to know in closing? What's a key thing that you want them to have from a takeaway from this conversation?
I would say it's showing compassion and understanding. Um, I feel that now more than before. Like I said before, back in my corporate days, uh, I really expected a lot, and I
Mhm.
expected people to show up in certain ways that I expected them to show up. And they're people, they can't always do that. And so just allow people a little bit of grace. We don't know what happened to them at home the night before, or the things that they're going through. And connect with them in a non-work environment. Maybe it's
Mm,
having lunch, or just having a chat with them, or noticing something that they might have put up in their cubicle, or something different about them that shows their personality. And ask just ask them about life.
yeah.
What's important to them.
Oh, I love that. That's so good. And Lark, what's the one best way people can get in touch with you?
So I'm LinkedIn, Lark Galley. There's one way
Okay.
there.
Okay.
Website is larkdeangalley.com.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Thank you for that. So if people need to get in touch with you, talk more about grief services and support, it's great. So thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me today on today's Top Leaders and talking about this very vulnerable and yet very important topic about how we're dealing with grief in the holidays. And as we've identified, it's not just during the holidays, it keeps expanding year round. But thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. It's wonderful. All right, my friends, if you're needing support with your team and any kind of coaching, you can reach me at movingforwardsolutions.com. Go ahead and schedule a consult and be happy to talk with you about what we can do to help you become the tech leader that everyone wants to work for, because you and your people are worth it. See you next time.